Winter, 1944. A German infantry platoon digs into frozen ground, waiting for the familiar rhythm of enemy artillery. They expect ranging shots. They expect time to move.
Steady.
Instead, American shells strike perfectly, the first rounds landing exactly on their positions. No corrections. No warning. No escape. Veterans stare in disbelief. Officers shout too late. Stay with us, because what American gunners unleashed here rewrote the rules of modern warfare forever. Before American artillery ever entered the European battlefield, German soldiers believed they understood how firepower worked. For decades, artillery had followed a predictable rhythm. Guns fired. Shells landed short or wide. Observers watched the impacts. Corrections were calculated. Only then did destruction arrive. This sequence was not just technical doctrine, it shaped survival instincts. Infantry learned to listen. Officers learned to count seconds. Entire units relied on that narrow window between first impact and corrected fire to scatter, dig deeper, or escape. Germany's confidence in this pattern came from experience. The First World War had taught European armies that artillery was powerful but imperfect. Even the most disciplined batteries needed adjustment. Maps were flawed. Weather distorted trajectories. Human error was unavoidable. Precision required time, and time created opportunity. By the late 1930s, German artillery doctrine reflected this reality. Forward observers were skilled, but communication lines were fragile. Calculations were often decentralized, dependent on individual batteries and field conditions. Speed mattered, but accuracy still arrived gradually. Soldiers trusted that no gun could strike perfectly without revealing itself first. This belief followed German forces into the Second World War. In Poland and France, artillery behaved as expected. Even under heavy fire, the opening rounds announced themselves. Soviet artillery on the Eastern Front was massive but inconsistent, often trading volume for accuracy. British guns emphasized coordination but still relied on correction fire. Across the battlefields of Europe, the pattern held. When shells began to fall, there was usually a moment, brief, dangerous, but real, to react. That expectation hardened into doctrine. German infantry manuals emphasized movement after initial impacts. Defensive positions were designed with the assumption that the first salvos would miss or strike nearby. Commanders trained their men to survive the opening fire and reposition before the corrected barrage arrived. The battlefield rewarded those instincts. Many lived because of them. Then the war widened. When the United States entered the conflict, German commanders initially underestimated its ground forces. American soldiers were new to European combat. Their officers were untested against seasoned Wehrmacht units. Their artillery, German planners assumed, would behave like everyone else's, loud, powerful, but predictable. This assumption seemed reasonable. Artillery was still artillery. Physics had not changed. Shells still traveled through air, affected by wind, temperature, and terrain. Precision still required observation. Or so it seemed. Yet behind the front lines, far from German intelligence reports, something different was taking shape. American military planners had studied the failures of earlier wars closely. They did not focus solely on guns or shell size. Instead, they examined the entire process of firing, how targets were identified, how data moved, how decisions were made, and how time was measured. Where European armies treated artillery as an extension of the gun crew, the United States approached it as a system. Training reflected this philosophy. American artillery officers were taught to think mathematically, not intuitively. Crews memorized standardized procedures that left little room for improvisation. Every battery spoke the same technical language. Every calculation followed the same steps. Individual brilliance mattered less than consistency. This approach extended beyond training fields. Survey units mapped terrain with extreme precision. Time synchronization became doctrine, not convenience. Communications were built with redundancy, anticipating disruption before it occurred. The goal was not merely to fire faster, but to fire correctly, before the enemy could react. German intelligence noticed fragments of this shift but failed to grasp its implications. Reports mentioned unusually rapid American responses. Some noted fewer ranging shots. Others described fire arriving suddenly. These observations were dismissed as isolated incidents or exaggerations. No army, German analysts believed, could eliminate correction fire entirely. They were wrong. As American forces moved deeper into combat zones, across North Africa, into Italy, and eventually onto the beaches and hedgerows of Western Europe, the battlefield itself began to feel different. German units encountered artillery that did not behave as expected. Patterns failed. Timelines collapsed. Instincts built over years of fighting no longer worked. The war had reached a point where experience alone could no longer protect soldiers. And as German infantry began to realize this, often too late, the reason behind American accuracy was already in place, invisible, methodical, and waiting to be understood. American artillery did not become accurate on the battlefield. It arrived that way. Long before a single shell left the barrel, precision had already been decided, on paper, on maps, and in quiet rooms far behind the guns. Where other armies relied on observers reacting to impact, the United States designed a process that reduced uncertainty before the first round was fired. At the center of this system stood the Fire Direction Center. Unlike traditional artillery command, which placed much of the burden on individual gun crews or forward observers, American doctrine centralized thinking. Fire Direction Centers received target information, calculated firing solutions, and issued commands to multiple guns simultaneously. Crews no longer guessed. They executed. Every variable was accounted for. Distance, elevation, powder temperature, barrel wear, weather. Even the curvature of the earth over long ranges was factored into firing tables. These were not approximations. They were standardized calculations drilled repeatedly until error margins shrank to near invisibility. Training reinforced this discipline relentlessly. American artillerymen were not taught to feel their shots. They were taught to trust numbers. Crews trained until mathematical steps became instinctive. If two different units received the same target data, they would produce the same firing solution, every time. This consistency mattered more than raw experience. It meant that accuracy did not depend on veteran intuition or battlefield improvisation. A newly arrived battery could deliver the same precision as a seasoned one. For German soldiers accustomed to spotting correction shots, this removed a crucial warning sign. Mapping was another quiet advantage. American survey units worked methodically, often under fire, to establish precise grid systems. Gun positions were measured, not estimated. Target areas were pre-registered whenever possible, meaning firing data already existed before combat began. When a request came in, the guns did not need to search. They already knew where to aim. Time itself became a weapon. American units synchronized watches down to the second. This allowed multiple batteries to fire so that shells arrived simultaneously on target, even when fired from different locations. Known as time on target, this technique denied the enemy the most basic survival instinct, the ability to react to the first impact. German artillery doctrine relied on spotting that first shell. American doctrine removed it. Communications made this system viable. Radios were standard, not scarce. Procedures were uniform across units, allowing observers, fire direction officers, and gun crews to speak the same technical language. If one line failed, another replaced it. Requests moved quickly, often faster than German counter-battery teams could respond. None of this was dramatic on its own. There were no secret weapons or revolutionary shells. The guns themselves were conventional. What changed was the process surrounding them. Accuracy was no longer the result of correction. It was the product of preparation. This approach reflected broader American industrial thinking. Just as factories emphasized repeatable processes over individual craftsmanship, artillery doctrine emphasized systems over heroics. Mistakes were designed out before they occurred. Success depended less on battlefield genius and more on organizational discipline. German intelligence struggled to interpret this shift. Reports described American fire as sudden or unusually precise, but explanations remained vague. Some officers attributed it to luck. Others assumed observers were simply closer. Few recognized that the guns were no longer reacting, they were executing pre-calculated solutions with industrial efficiency. For German soldiers on the ground, the effect was deeply unsettling. Artillery no longer announced itself. There was no familiar sequence of short rounds, long rounds, and gradual tightening. The first shells struck where men were already hiding. Trenches collapsed instantly. Dugouts offered no warning. Movement, once a reliable response, became deadly. The battlefield felt hostile in a new way, not louder, not more violent, but more certain. By the time German units realized what they were facing, it was already too late to adapt. Their instincts betrayed them. Their experience failed them. And the psychological shock of that realization spread faster than any barrage. What German soldiers felt next was not just fear of destruction, but fear of an enemy whose precision seemed invisible, unstoppable, and impossible to predict. For German soldiers trained to survive artillery by instinct, American fire shattered every assumption they had learned to trust. The first reaction was confusion. Men waited for the familiar sequence, the short round, the long round, the pause. Instead, explosions arrived without rhythm. Shells struck trenches, foxholes, and reverse slopes on the first impact. The ground convulsed where soldiers were already lying flat, exactly where doctrine told them to be safest. Veterans who had survived years on the Eastern Front froze. They had learned to read artillery like weather. This felt different. There was no time to interpret, no margin to adjust. The battlefield offered no clues. Officers shouted orders that no longer worked. Move after the first shells sent men directly into lethal zones. Dig deeper, came too late. Positions that should have been secure were struck with mechanical certainty. The earth itself seemed to betray them. German after-action reports repeatedly described the same sensation, fire that appeared to know where men were before they moved. Soldiers spoke of artillery that felt instant, as if the guns had been waiting. Some described it as walking into a trap that had already been set. Fear spread unevenly, then all at once. The absence of warning was more terrifying than the violence. There was no sound to interpret, no time to count. The first explosion was also the decisive one. This inverted the emotional logic of combat. Survival no longer depended on experience. It depended on chance. As barrages continued, German units began to break in unfamiliar ways. Not under overwhelming numbers or sustained pressure, but under the realization that reaction itself had become useless. Men hesitated, unsure whether moving or staying put was safer. That hesitation proved fatal. Communication suffered quickly. Runners were killed before messages arrived. Radio operators were targeted by precision fire that suggested positions had already been identified. Commanders struggled to regain control, issuing orders based on assumptions that no longer applied. Even counter-battery fire faltered. German artillery crews, trained to respond after spotting enemy rounds, found no reference point. Without visible correction shots, locating American batteries became guesswork. By the time German guns fired, American positions had already shifted or fallen silent. Morale eroded quietly. This was not the panic of sudden assault, but the dread of inevitability. Soldiers spoke of feeling watched, measured, calculated. Artillery was no longer a blunt force. It felt deliberate, personal. Some units attempted adaptation. Troops dispersed further. Positions were rotated more frequently. But the underlying problem remained. American fire arrived faster than German adjustments could compensate. Every movement risked exposure. Every pause risked annihilation. The psychological toll compounded over time. Men slept poorly, knowing that the next shell would not announce itself. Dugouts offered little comfort. The ground that once protected now felt exposed. Confidence in leadership weakened as orders failed to deliver safety. German officers, many hardened by years of fighting, admitted privately that something fundamental had changed. They were not facing superior bravery or heavier guns. They were facing a system that stripped away human reaction time. The battlefield had become hostile in a new way, quiet, efficient, unforgiving. As reports filtered upward through German command channels, the same words appeared again and again. Precise. Immediate. No warning. These were not exaggerations. They were attempts to describe an enemy method that defied established logic. And as German commanders struggled to understand what had undone their soldiers so completely, the true explanation lay not in the explosions themselves, but in the technology and methods that made such precision possible, long before the first shell ever fell. What German soldiers experienced as sudden, perfect fire was not intuition or luck. It was technology applied with discipline. American artillery had quietly removed the need for correction shots by changing how targets were found, fixed, and shared. The battlefield was no longer interpreted after shells landed. It was measured in advance. One of the most decisive tools was sound ranging. Specialized American units deployed arrays of microphones along the front. When an enemy gun fired, the sound reached each microphone at a slightly different time. These delays were recorded, calculated, and converted into precise coordinates. German batteries could be located without ever being seen. No spotting rounds were required. No observers exposed themselves. Flash ranging added another layer. At night or in low visibility, observers detected the muzzle flash of enemy artillery. By triangulating the angle from multiple points, American units could fix positions rapidly. Combined with sound data, this created targeting solutions that were both fast and reliable. German guns that believed themselves hidden were often already marked. But locating enemy artillery was only part of the system. Pre-registration changed everything. American units methodically recorded firing data for roads, tree lines, crossroads, ridge lines, and likely defensive positions. These were not guesses. Each location was calculated, tested, and stored. When troops later occupied those positions, American guns did not need to search. They simply executed. This meant the first round was no longer exploratory. It was deliberate. Communication made this speed usable. Radios connected observers, fire direction centers, and gun crews in a continuous loop. Requests moved in seconds, not minutes. Corrections, when needed, were minimal and often unnecessary. German counter-battery teams found themselves reacting to fire that had already achieved its purpose. Time on target pushed this advantage further. Instead of firing as soon as calculations were complete, American batteries waited. Each gun fired at a precisely calculated moment so that shells from multiple locations arrived simultaneously. To those on the receiving end, there was no buildup. No warning sequence. The entire barrage struck at once. This was devastating psychologically. German doctrine relied on the first impacts to trigger movement. Time on target denied that instinct. There was no safe direction to run. The moment artillery announced itself, the decisive damage had already been done. Weather, once a limiting factor, was integrated into American calculations. Wind, air density, and temperature were measured and adjusted for systematically. These variables had plagued artillery accuracy in earlier wars. Now they were simply inputs. Even barrel wear was tracked. As guns fired, their performance changed slightly. American crews recorded these changes and adjusted firing tables accordingly. Accuracy did not degrade unpredictably. It was managed. To German soldiers, none of this was visible. They did not see microphones buried in the ground. They did not see surveyors mapping under fire. They did not hear calculations being performed miles away. All they experienced was the result, shells landing where men already were, without warning. German countermeasures lagged behind. Their systems required confirmation. Observers needed visual reference. Corrections took time. Against American methods, that time no longer existed. The battlefield had accelerated beyond human reflex. Reports from German units increasingly described American artillery as immediate and mechanical. These were not insults. They were attempts to articulate a frightening truth. The enemy was no longer reacting. He was executing a process already in motion. By the time German command recognized the scope of this technological shift, it had already reshaped combat across multiple fronts. The advantage was not tied to a single battle or location. It traveled with American units wherever they went. And when these methods were combined with large-scale operations, where speed, surprise, and coordination mattered most, the results were not merely impressive. They were decisive. The stage was set for moments when American artillery would no longer support the battle, but define it, turning precision into shock, and preparation into sudden, overwhelming force. The moment when American artillery revealed its full effect did not arrive with a single battle. It arrived repeatedly, across different fronts, until denial was no longer possible. In Normandy, the terrain magnified the shock. German units fought from hedgerows that had protected defenders for generations. Thick earth walls and dense vegetation limited visibility and movement. Traditionally, artillery struggled here. Observation was poor. Corrections took time. Infantry believed the terrain would shield them. American guns erased that confidence. When German positions were identified, fire did not creep forward. It arrived complete. Shells struck hedgerows, reverse slopes, and concealed trenches with immediate accuracy. Entire sections were neutralized before officers could issue orders. The terrain that once absorbed violence now trapped it. German attempts to relocate were cut short by follow-on barrages that anticipated movement routes. Pre-registered roads and exits turned retreat into exposure. Survivors later recalled that the safest instinct, movement, had become the most dangerous choice. In Italy, the effect was even starker. Mountain warfare demanded precision. Guns firing uphill faced complex calculations. Wind shifted unpredictably. Elevation distorted range. German units believed these conditions would blunt enemy fire. Instead, American artillery adapted seamlessly. Fire direction centers adjusted data methodically. Surveyed positions removed guesswork. When German troops occupied ridgelines or valleys, shells arrived without warning. Dug-in positions collapsed under first impacts. Narrow mountain paths became lethal corridors under time-on-target barrages that struck simultaneously along entire routes. German units withdrew not because they were outnumbered, but because holding ground became impossible. Artillery no longer softened positions. It erased them. Then came the Ardennes. In the dense forests and winter fog of December 1944, German forces launched their final major offensive. Surprise was their greatest asset. Visibility was poor. Air support was limited. Artillery would decide everything. American gunners operated under conditions that should have favored the attacker. Yet when German units revealed themselves, the response was immediate and devastating. Sound ranging located firing batteries through forest and snow. Pre-calculated firing data allowed guns to respond without visual confirmation. When requests came in, fire direction centers acted without hesitation. Time-on-target barrages shattered German formations preparing to advance. Units that believed themselves concealed were struck simultaneously across multiple positions. The effect was not just physical destruction, but collapse of coordination. Assaults stalled before they began. German commanders attempted counter-battery fire, but without visible correction shots, their efforts were blind. American guns fired, achieved effect, and displaced. The exchange ended before it truly began. What defined these moments was not volume of fire, but certainty. American artillery removed the learning curve from combat. There was no adjustment phase. No escalation. The first engagement was the decisive one. This compressed the entire experience of artillery into a single, overwhelming instant. For German soldiers, this altered the meaning of exposure. Previously, a position became dangerous after it was discovered. Now, discovery and destruction were inseparable. The moment a unit was identified, it was already too late. This realization spread rapidly through ranks, undermining morale more effectively than sustained bombardment ever could. German after-action reports from late 1944 and early 1945 reveal a shift in language. Descriptions move away from heavy fire or intense barrages. Instead, they emphasize speed, simultaneity, and inevitability. Officers noted that American artillery arrived without warning and achieved full effect immediately. These were not exaggerations. They were acknowledgments. The psychological impact extended beyond infantry. Tank crews found assembly areas struck before engines could warm. Command posts were targeted with precision that suggested pre-knowledge. Supply routes became dangerous minutes after use. The battlefield felt smaller. Time felt compressed. Decisions that once unfolded over hours now had to be made in seconds. German command structures, built around observation and response, struggled to operate in this environment. Initiative drained upward as officers waited for clarity that never came. Meanwhile, American artillery functioned almost autonomously. Observers requested fire. Fire direction centers calculated. Guns executed. The process repeated with mechanical reliability. Individual heroics mattered less than system performance. The result was consistency under chaos. By late war, German units adjusted their behavior, not tactically, but psychologically. They avoided movement. They dispersed excessively. They hesitated. None of these measures restored control. They merely delayed the inevitable. What had changed was not just who fired better. What had changed was how warfare measured time. American artillery collapsed the interval between detection and destruction. It denied the enemy the space in which experience once mattered. Survival was no longer a function of learning the battlefield. It was a function of avoiding it altogether. When the guns finally fell silent after these engagements, the silence carried weight. Not relief. Understanding. German soldiers knew they had encountered something that could not be countered by courage, skill, or endurance. They had faced a system designed to act faster than human reaction. And once that realization set in, the consequences extended far beyond the battlefield, reshaping the remainder of the war and forcing a reckoning that would continue long after the last shell was fired. When the fighting moved on, the evidence remained. German positions once considered defensible were reduced to patterns of impact craters and collapsed earthworks. Trenches that had offered protection in earlier campaigns were now markers of exposure. The damage itself was familiar. What was different was how quickly it had been done. Casualty reports reflected this shift. German units engaged by American artillery suffered disproportionate losses during the opening moments of contact. There was less dispersion, fewer wounded who survived the first strike, and a higher rate of command disruption. Officers were often among the earliest casualties, targeted not by chance, but by the collapse of predictable movement patterns. Withdrawals followed a new logic. Instead of retreating under pressure, many German units disengaged preemptively. Positions were abandoned not because they were overrun, but because holding them invited immediate destruction. This represented a fundamental change in battlefield behavior. Artillery had not merely supported maneuver, it dictated it. German command recognized this, even if reluctantly. Late-war assessments acknowledged American artillery as unusually effective. Reports emphasized speed of response, accuracy of first salvos, and the difficulty of counter-battery action. Some officers noted that American fire arrived already adjusted, a phrase that appeared repeatedly in debriefings. These observations were not accompanied by excuses. They were technical acknowledgments of inferiority in process, not bravery. German gunners were experienced. Their equipment was capable. What they lacked was time. Strategically, the impact was cumulative. American infantry advanced with greater confidence, knowing artillery could suppress or neutralize threats instantly. Defensive lines collapsed more rapidly once exposed. German reserves were committed cautiously, aware that assembly areas were vulnerable the moment they were used. Supply routes suffered as well. Roads once used freely became high-risk corridors. Pre-registered fire zones meant that predictable movement invited immediate engagement. German logistics slowed, not from shortages alone, but from fear of detection. Psychologically, the battlefield shifted. Soldiers no longer judged safety by terrain or concealment. They judged it by invisibility. The moment a position was identified, by sound, flash, or communication, it was assumed compromised. This constant uncertainty eroded morale steadily, even in units not directly engaged. By early 1945, American artillery dominance was no longer debated within German ranks. It was accepted. Adaptation focused on avoidance rather than confrontation. Units dispersed, limited radio use, and reduced firing activity, not to fight better, but to survive longer. The broader war reflected this imbalance. Operations progressed with fewer delays. Breakthroughs accelerated once artillery cleared resistance instantly. The cumulative effect was momentum, strategic, operational, psychological. What American gunners had achieved was not just tactical superiority. They had altered the rhythm of war. Engagements resolved faster. Decisions compressed. Opportunities vanished before they could be exploited. As the conflict neared its end, this reality shaped expectations for future warfare. The question was no longer how to fire more shells, but how to act faster than the enemy could react. And as armies across the world studied the outcomes of these battles, one conclusion became unavoidable. Artillery had crossed a threshold, from reactive firepower to decisive, immediate force. The implications of that shift would extend far beyond the ruins left behind, influencing doctrine, technology, and the very way modern armies understood time on the battlefield. When the war ended, the guns fell silent, but the lessons they revealed did not. What American artillery demonstrated was not simply superior firepower. It revealed a deeper transformation in how warfare functioned. For centuries, combat had allowed space for human reaction. Soldiers listened, watched, adapted. Survival depended on experience, instinct, and the ability to respond under pressure. That space began to disappear. American gunners did not remove danger from the battlefield. They removed delay. Precision arrived without warning. Decisions that once unfolded over minutes collapsed into seconds. In that compression of time, traditional instincts lost their value. This shift was not emotional. It was structural. Artillery became an expression of systems thinking, of preparation replacing improvisation, of coordination replacing individual brilliance. The battlefield rewarded those who could organize information faster than the enemy could respond. Courage still mattered. Endurance still mattered. But they were no longer enough on their own. For the soldiers who faced this change, the experience was deeply unsettling. They were not outmatched by strength or numbers, but by inevitability. The moment they were detected, the outcome was already in motion. There was no conversation with fate, only consequence. After the war, armies studied these results closely. Artillery doctrine evolved. Fire control became centralized. Precision and timing replaced volume. What had stunned German soldiers became the foundation of modern military planning. Yet beneath the efficiency lay a sobering truth. As warfare grew more precise, it also grew less personal. Decisions made far from the front carried immediate, irreversible effects. The distance between calculation and destruction narrowed until it nearly vanished. The story of American gunners who never needed corrections is not a story of perfection. It is a story of transition. A moment when war crossed from reaction into inevitability. And in that crossing, something fundamental changed. The battlefield no longer waited for human judgment to catch up. It moved on its own schedule.